Storm Kira, everyone. Dirty weather. Please come indoors. Hello and welcome to Alex the Model Kits. This is an update just to let you know what I've been doing since my last update in January. So I think the first thing to talk about really is the Saturn V launch pad. I was talking about that last time round, and I've done a little bit of work on it since, and maybe it's time to have a look at what's been done with that so far. Back in September last year, I started to work on a paper and card model of the Saturn V launch pad. This was the first paper and card kit I'd tried, and it looked like an interesting build. The first stage of the build is to build the platform that the rocket and launch tower will rest on, including the blast pit for the rocket exhaust during the launch. The instructions tell you that you must reinforce the entire platform so it can hold the weight of what will be placed on top of it, and so I began to think about how I wanted to make that reinforcement. I tried various ideas, including thick card and balsa wood, but eventually settled on a combination of balsa wood and styrene sheet. The blast pit also includes 4 parts that step out from each side that would support the weight of the rocket over the top of the blast pit. Here 2 have been constructed from the kit, while the remaining 2 supports wait to be cut out from the paper surround and then folded and glued. Once constructed, they will then need reinforcement to be placed inside, which will be done using balsa wood battens cut to size. Having decided on what to use, I began to create the reinforcing sheets and attach them to the card parts. Here you can see how the reinforcing steps will fit around the blast pit. Then the piece of paper of the actual deck will be added over the top of the styrene sheet. Styrene will also be added to the external walls that will fit around the outside of the deck. It was then that I discovered a problem, and a fairly significant problem at that. The parts don't fit. The sidewalls are shorter than the deck. Here we can see the deck, with each sidewall laid next to the side it will attach to. The front and back walls are clearly too short, but what is less clear is that the left and right walls are also short. Zooming in, I've lined the far edge of the 2 pieces so they line up with the deck out of shot, and now we can see that the parts are short and by a significant amount. The obvious solution is to trim the deck to match the parts, but the deck comes with a small border that folds down over each side to help provide a seamless join. Cutting those off and then reattaching them will then show a cardboard seam. Another option is to cut not at the edges but further in, but the mottled surface will probably always show the join. And with so much else waiting to be fixed to the deck later on, any trimming feels like I'll be creating problems later in the build. So, frustratingly, I've decided to bring this project to an end and move on to something else. So there you have it, quite a frustrating end to a project, to be honest. I don't often tend to abandon a kit halfway through. I do tend to try and work my way through them, but this one I felt was the amount of work involved was not going to give me a result that I was going to be happy with, and so I felt that's probably the best thing to do was just, as I say, step away from it and move on to something else. I'm quite frustrated. I'm quite annoyed at myself for not doing something as simple as dry fitting everything to begin with. With a styrene kit I'd always do it. You know, it's kind of natural, isn't it? With a styrene kit you cut the pieces out, you fit them against whatever they're going to, and that helps you to know what you need to do for the kit build. And I think I never really assumed that you'd need to do the same for a paper kit. With a styrene kit I can see the reasons why. There are many reasons why styrene won't always fit together. Things can warp, or there can be old toolings, or numerous reasons why styrene doesn't quite fit as it should. But I did kind of feel that a paper and card kit that's been printed should not have any fit issues. My first job, when I left school, I worked in a drawing office making maps and charts and doing land surveys, and we produced the maps themselves, and if they were going to be used for scale purposes, we'd send them off for printing. If on those rare occasions they weren't being used for scale, they were just being used for reference purposes, we could photocopy them. But we had to have a big marker on the photocopy to say, photocopy, do not use for scaling. Because photocopies will stretch, and they stretch in non-uniform ways. So a certain corner might stretch and a certain part might sort of shrink slightly. And so you could never really guarantee a photocopy would be exactly to scale. But printing, on the other hand, if you wanted to produce scale plans, printing was a reliable way of doing it. And I had assumed that the kit itself had been printed. In fact, thinking about the problem we've got, the four walls they all line up with each other. They just don't line up with the platform. So it's not a case of shrinking and stretching. It is a case of just actually the parts are not they are not measured correctly and not produced correctly. So, like I say, I'm annoyed with myself for not dry fitting earlier. If I'd dry fitted, back in September, October time, I probably would have stopped at that point and got on with something else. But I'm also annoyed with the manufacturer because, I do kind of feel it's an error on their part. And like I said in the film, I think there are ways of trying to get around it, but I think each of those ways generates another problem, and it gets to the point where you think, do you know what, I think I'd rather move on and do something else. Let's just cut our losses and go for something else instead. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put that to one side and move on. I have resisted the urge to take everything out to the middle of the road and ceremonially set fire to it, because I have got a vague idea in the back of my head about not building that kit but using it as a basis for something else. I'd always had this idea in my head about building the paper kit, and then maybe in 2 or 3 years time completely scratch building from styrene another launch tower, but this time adding lights so that you could have sort of little LEDs for each of the decks for the engineers and technicians who would be working at night. And I quite like the idea. I think some of the photographs you see of Saturn V's waiting for launch, particularly ones at night when it's all lit up and you've got spotlights shining up at the rocket and you've got the lights in the towers themselves, I always think it looks quite good. And the idea of trying to recreate that has kind of struck me as being quite a nice idea. So the plan was to use the card model that I was going to make as a basis in terms of the measurements and dimensions for a scratch-built styrene kit. And I'm still going to think about that. I've kept it off to one side. It's not going to take up a lot of space. It's kind of slotted down the side somewhere. And so maybe in a few years' time I might unpack it and start doing some measurements and then maybe build something from scratch. But we'll wait and see. Plenty to do, so I might not bother with that, but we'll wait and see. So time to move on to the next kit, and the next kit is really on the basis of a group build that I've joined in with. I mentioned in the last video that a chap called Ian Poulton, who has a YouTube channel called UK Scale Modeler, he often runs group builds which are well attended and very popular. And in the last video I was talking about the fact that he had opened it up for voting as to what category to vote on, and 3 categories to vote on were National Pride, Shelf of Doom and Record Breakers. And National Pride won the vote by quite a large margin. So for me, I'm going to be building this kit here. 1/48 scale Airfix Blenheim, Bristol Blenheim Mark 1F. I'm keen to build this for a couple of reasons really. Firstly, I got this from my wife. At Christmas time, so it's quite a new kit for me, and it looks very good. I'm quite enthusiastic about it, and so I was keen to move on to it as quickly as possible. But the other reason that I wanted to use it for this group build is because the group build title is National Pride, and the Blenheim has an interesting history because it was not it was not an aircraft that the Air Ministry and the RAF sought initially. What normally happens is the RAF and the Air Ministry in the 20s, 30s and 40s, and even now I guess, will analyse what they think they need, and then I'll put out a specification for manufacturers to make an aircraft that meets that specification. And that wasn't the case with the Blenheim. What happened with the Blenheim was that a newspaper magnate by the name of Lord Rosmere, I believe, he was quite a patriotic chap, and was quite keen to show that British aviation was the best in the world, or amongst the best in the world. And so he asked the Bristol Aircraft Company to build an aircraft for him, which was going to be the latest aircraft using all the latest technology. Had to be really fast, had to have light passenger and light freight capacity, and the idea was he would use it for his business to fly quickly around the world for his various offices around the world. And they built, Bristol built him two prototypes initially, well, on paper two prototypes anyway, the Type 142 and the Type 143. And the 142 used every single latest technology available to the aviation industry at the time. So things like retractable undercarriage, stressed metal skin, these things were really very new indeed, and made a massive difference to the speed of the aircraft. The Type 143 was a slightly, it was a less ambitious idea. It was more, it didn't have quite as many features involved with it, and it was slower. And Lord Rosmere instantly went for the 142 and said, that's the aircraft I want. So they built him a single aircraft, which Bristol knew as the Type 142, and Lord Rosmere christened it Britain First. And he then took it down to the Air Ministry for, I forget which airfield it was. It wasn't Boscombe Down. Yeah, I forget which airfield it was, but he had, before he can use it, he had to get a certificate of airworthiness, and so it was taken down to an Air Ministry airfield for evaluation to get a certificate of airworthiness. And at that point they realised that this twin-engined passenger aircraft was actually faster than anything that the RAF had in terms of fighter aircraft. The latest fighter aircraft at the time was a Gloucester Gladiator, and this Bristol Britain First was outrunning it by quite a way. And so that kind of raised a few eyebrows, and the RAF thought we'd better get a few of these and we can use them as bombers. So they then asked Bristol for the plans for the aircraft, and Lord Rosmere, on hearing this, actually gave them his aircraft. I think he paid £5,000 for it, and he handed it over to Air Ministry as being, well, you go right ahead and do what you want with it. And out of that, the Blenheim came into being, and was designed originally as a bomber. But they also attached a gun pack, which you can't really see in this image, but just down here is a gun pack with 4 machine guns, to try and turn it into what's kind of known as a heavy fighter or long range fighter. A lot of countries were sort of experimenting with that idea to varying degrees of success, usually not with much success at all. And Britain was no different. We had several aircraft that we tried to develop as long range or heavy fighters, and some kind of worked and some didn't. I think, to be honest, the only heavy fighter that really worked well was the P-38. But yeah, so I'm digressing now and going on to various things, but let's have a look at the what is in the box. Let's have a look at what Airfix are producing for this kit. This is the Airfix 148 scale Bristol Blenheim Mark 1F. On opening the box, it's pretty much what you'd expect from an Airfix kit. The parts are held together in a single plastic bag. There is a large instruction booklet, plus a separate colour sheet showing the 2 colour schemes that Airfix provide with this kit. The first is a dark earth and dark green camouflage with night undersides, and the second is an all-night covering. Both schemes are for night fighters. The instruction book is A4 sized, so nice and big with the usual clear instructions inside, and takes you through building this kit in a mere 116 steps. The decal sheet is fairly simple but looks nice and is printed by Cartograph, so there should be no worries about the quality of them. The kit comes with 7 sprues, plus a clear sprue in a separate plastic bag. The detail of the parts looks very good, and 2 complete Bristol Mercury 8 engines are included. This kit is for the Blenheim Mark 1F, which is a fighter variant of the Blenheim. About 80 bombers were converted to fighters by attaching a gun pack containing 4 machine guns to the underside of the aircraft, where the bomb bay would normally be. So the gun pack is provided on a small sprue, as well as the antenna used for the air interception radar that night fighters were equipped with. But Airfix clearly have plans to release a bomber version of this kit, as bombs are also included. A pilot is included, but oddly no other crew. The Blenheim had a 3-man crew: pilot, navigator and gunner, so it seems odd that Airfix have not included the other 2 crewmen. As mentioned before, the detail on this kit is excellent. This is a new tooling from Airfix, released just a couple of years ago, and Airfix has done a great job of including some very fine detail. The clear sprue when out of the bag looks very good, well moulded and with the same level of detail as the rest of the kit. So there we are. It's quite a nice kit. I am quite enthusiastic about it and I'm looking forward to making it. I've made a little bit of progress so far. Pretty much I've made the first page of the instructions, and that gives us this. So we've got the bomb bay down here, and then just above there we've got a gap, and then these 2 prongs are the wing spars. I'm normally quite good at seeing the geography of an aircraft and understanding what I'm looking at and what I'm fitting together, and I had thought that this tub area here would be kind of the seating area for the turret, the upper turret, but I've realised that that's not the case. If we place this in here, so we've got a bomb bay showing just in there, and then we've got the tub just in there, and then the gun turret itself sits back here. So so I'm not entirely sure what that's for. I've looked through the instructions and nothing really seems to sit in there. So I think, and it is a guess, I think the life raft goes in there, and I think also there is a hatch that sits over the top, which can be, I think the instructions show it as being closed up, but I will experiment to see if I can leave the hatch open. And the plan is to have this kit kind of in a bit of maintenance. The other thing I think I can do, and at the moment I'm saying I think I can do this, I think I can do that. I think I'll find out as I go along, but in the back of my head, looking at the instructions, the impression I get is that the engine covers on the cowlings can either be removed, or rather not removed, but left off, or they could be added to the kit, but in an open fashion, so it looks like the aircraft is being worked on. And I think that's what I'm going to try and do. I want to try and, the engines look quite nice in my view. I want to try and find a way of exposing at least one of the engines, and the plan is to try and have it with the cowling covers off or open, so that it's being worked on. I'm also not too sure about the colour scheme I want to use. Both the schemes that the kit comes with are night fighter schemes, and one I think is an unusual night fighter scheme, which is the destructive camouflage scheme on the top and then the night undersides. And I think most of the night fighters in the early part of the war were, I think they were painted night all over, black all over. So I don't know, I'm not sure I want to use that. I don't want to use the all over night scheme, because I think whilst it's a good accurate representation of a night fighter, I think what I'll end up with my modelling skills is just a large black lump of plastic. I watched someone in the last group build. I watched someone do a night fighter, a German night fighter, and they did a fantastic job. They managed to get some weathering onto it and brought out the panel lines, and it just looked fantastic. And I don't think I've got the skills to do that, sadly. So I think if I go for this as all black, it will just look a bit sort of just not so good in my view. And I think also opening up the engines, I think that the overall blackness will just kind of swallow some of that detail, and I really want that to sort of stand out. So I'm going to go with certainly a disruptive camouflage scheme of dark green and dark earth on the top. And I'm kind of trying to find a way that they did have them with the Sky Type S undersides, which is the beige colour, and I'm quite keen to do that. In fact, Airfix, if I just move this over here, Airfix are quite keen on this kit. I'm quite keen on this kit, and Airfix are quite keen on the Blenheims as well, because they've released 4 Blenheims as far as I'm aware. They've got the 1/148 scale that I've talked about. They've also got the 1/72 scale, the same version, the Mark 1F. They also have a 72nd scale, the Mark 1, which is a bomber version, and then finally they've got the Mark 4F, which is a fighter version, a later version, but still a fighter version, again with a gun pack underneath. And on the Mark 1F at 1/72 scale, they do have a version with the Sky underside, and this version was based at Manston, which is not just down the road from me, but it's not too far away from me, and I've been down there a few times. They've got one very good museum and one slightly less good museum, but it's an odd arrangement. They've got a car park, and on one side they've got the Manston Airfield Museum, and on the other side they've got the Spitfire and Hurricane Museum. And the Manston Air Museum, I've been in a few times, and I found the staff quite unfriendly, quite grumpy, to be honest. Whereas the Spitfire and Hurricane Museum, really friendly. And the Spitfire and Hurricane Museum, by the way, has a fantastic cafe. It's worth going to just to have a bite to eat. So if you're over down Manston Way, I recommend going to the Spitfire and Hurricane Museum for something to eat there. Why am I talking about that? I'm talking about that because it's the colour scheme, and I'm quite interested in doing that colour scheme, but of course I haven't got the decals to reflect that, and I've been looking around for decals that might reflect that scheme, and I'm still on the lookout for it. I've not found anything that's I can use at 1/48 scale for that layout, but I'm looking around to see if I can find anything. And if I can, that's what I'll do. And if I can't find anything, then I'll probably look at doing an even earlier version, which will be sort of the half white and half black scheme that Fighter Command often used, because this was originally intended to be a day fighter. And the sad thing about Blenheims is that they all struggle quite badly, the bomber versions and the fighter versions, because whilst they were, when they first came out in 37 and 38, they were fantastic. Technology caught up, and the fighters then became that much better and faster. And when it actually came to going to war, Blenheim crews suffered atrociously, along with battle crews as well, because the RAF were using their day bombers in a slightly different way to the Germans, and I think that really caused them a lot of problems indeed. This is turning into quite a ramble, isn't it? I'm sorry about that. So I'll move straight on. So that is essentially where we are at the moment. That's the kit I'm working on at the moment. That's the progress I've had so far. And yeah, I think I'm looking forward to getting this done. So before I go, I've had a couple of letters coming in. One from Mrs. Trellis. Mrs. Trellis, thank you for your letter. She writes, "Dear Bernard of Alex's Model Kits, I'm having a bit of an argument with the girls at the Bridge Club about whether it is right to make the bed at a hotel or not, and can you advise?" Well, Mrs. Trellis, thank you for your letter. I understand your confusion and the arguments about it. I must say, when I first started using hotels, I would, my wife and I would make the bed, and then we'd realise that actually by the time we came back, the house staff had stripped the bed and made it again anyway. So we don't bother making the bed, but we do try and put it up so it looks tidy and it looks like it's not been abandoned or about to be entered into an art exhibition for Tracy Emin. So I hope that answers your question, Mrs. Trellis. The second question I had was from a Mr. Lockjaw. Mr. Lockjaw, thank you very much for your letter. And he writes, Dear Cecil, you talked recently about the Airfix release of the Vulcan bomber. What are your thoughts on the other Airfix releases coming up? Well, Mr. Lockjaw, you're quite right. I did talk about the Airfix Vulcan a little while ago, and I was quite excited about that and looking forward to it. I'm aware of two other releases coming up for Airfix this year. One is the 1/72 scale Bristol Beaufort. That's going to be interesting, I think, because it's not quite a Blenheim, but it's very similar. It was designed to be a maritime anti-shipping aircraft, and the intention was that they were going to take the Blenheim and just kind of make a few modifications and adjustments and then have it as an anti-shipping aircraft. But by the time Bristol had finished, they'd changed so much of the aircraft that it really did warrant being a separate aircraft in its own right, and so the Beaufort was born. And it's an interesting aircraft. Airfix haven't done it before, and it's an often overlooked aircraft because I think it kind of, it started out at the beginning of the war, and by the end of the war it had been sort of superseded by aircraft like the Bristol Beaufighter, which was a sister aircraft to the Beaufort, and the de Havilland Mosquito, and they were used quite successfully for anti-shipping work. So the Beaufort tends to get forgotten about. So I'm really quite pleased that Airfix are coming out with that, and I definitely look forward to getting that and adding it to the list of unmade models that I've got kicking around the room. The other release I'm aware of is the 1/48 scale de Havilland Tiger Moth, which is a kind of a staple training aircraft from the 1930s. That's quite interesting. I'm coming round to 1/48 scale at the moment. I did the Seafire a little while ago at 1/48 scale and quite liked it. This looks really good, and if it fits together as well as it looks, then I think it should be a really nice model. And so I am quite enthusiastic about 1/48 scale at the moment, and I definitely look forward to getting that. I've also got the 1/48 scale Hawker Fury up there, which is the only aircraft I've rigged so far. So the Tiger Moth will need rigging as well, and that has a slightly different challenge about it, and I do kind of look forward to it. So yes, I'm on the whole very enthusiastic about the upcoming releases for Airfix. I've answered your question, Mr. Lockjaw. So with that, I think that's probably enough information for the moment. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again. Okay, thanks then, and goodbye.